Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We're glad that you could join us today to learn more about procurement opportunities with the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Thank you for being on time. We'd like to get started right away to give the maximum amount of time possible to our presenters and to you for questions and answers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jim Porter, Trade Services Manager and Aerospace and Defense Specialist at World Trade Center, Utah. Our mission is to help lead Utah's international business development, to increase prosperity in the state, to grow the state's global status, and to help build economic resiliency for businesses in Utah. As part of that work, it's our job to find and sponsor unique opportunities for businesses to learn about overseas opportunities, and the webinar today is one of those opportunities. Normally, we'd be able to meet around a table and discuss these opportunities one-on-one. In a COVID-19 world, we have to do much of this virtually, and we're very grateful today to be joined by Victor Mintz and Boris Manovich from the Israeli Ministry of Defense, who are going to tell us more about what the foreign military financing opportunities through Israel look like and how you can take advantage of them. You know, Israel is probably the U.S.'s most important security partner, and certainly the most important security partner in the Middle East, I should say. Cumulatively, Israel receives more foreign aid or foreign assistance from the U.S. than any other nation, and that's primarily military assistance. That relationship was renewed in 2016 when the U.S. and Israel signed an MOU that committed the U.S. to provide more than $3 billion annually to Israel in foreign military assistance, and more funding related to missile defense assistance and other defense-related missions. This webinar and any subsequent meetings that we're going to have will help you, Utah's defense suppliers, to learn about how to find and bid on opportunities that are funded by that aid. Utah is a strong aerospace and defense state and is well positioned to win contracts available through this opportunity. Our main presenters today, we have three main presenters today: Victor Mintz, Boris Manovich, and Sam Leon, and I want to introduce them briefly. Victor Mintz has worked with the government of Israel in their mission to the United States, which is located in New York, as general counsel since 1987. He supervises a legal staff responsible for negotiating and drafting the mission's procurement contracts and advising the mission's procurement personnel on all aspects of compliance with U.S. law, including U.S. export controls and foreign military financing guidelines. Victor has worked on numerous government-to-government cooperative R&D programs. He also serves as the Government of Israel Ministry of Defense's U.S. point of contact for the U.S. Department of Justice officials involved in legal proceedings related to the mission's FMF procurement. Prior to working at the mission, Victor Mintz worked for 4 years at the New York law firm of Freed, Hank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson. He graduated in 1983 from New York University School of Law and received his undergraduate degree in history from Muhlenberg College in 1980. Boris Manovich, who also works with the Ministry of Defense, has been in New York since 2017. He is a senior procurement specialist in the Economic and Cost Analysis Department. Prior to his position in the mission, he served for 6 years as a captain in the Israeli Defense Forces and as a financial analyst and advisor in the budgeting directorate of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Boris holds an MBA from the University of Tel Aviv and a Bachelor in Arts in Economics and Management from Technion, which is Israel's Institute of Technology. Later on during the presentation, we're also going to hear from Sam Leon. Sam is the regional manager at the U.S. Department of Commerce's Advocacy Center. Sam joined the Advocacy Center as a regional manager for the Levant, West, and North Africa in November 2019. In his role, he coordinates U.S. government support for American companies pursuing foreign government procurement opportunities. We're grateful for each of these presenters to be on today. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions to each of them about what they're sharing with us today. We also let me first cover the agenda. We're going to hear first from Ron Zamir, who is the chairperson of the the Utah Israeli Economic Council, and without whom this event wouldn't be possible. After Ron, we'll hear from Victor and Boris directly. That'll be the bulk of the meeting. After that, after their presentations, we'll take a minute for Q&A directly to Victor and Boris, after which we'll hear from Sam. And then with what time we have remaining, we'll open the meeting up to question and answers from everybody. So a logistical point here, if you have questions that you want to ask any of the presenters during the meeting, please ask those questions using the Q&A function, which you can find by moving your cursor to the bottom of the Zoom window and clicking Q&A. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions there, and those will pop up on my screen, and I'll be able to ensure that those questions get asked. I'll be the voice of those questions during the Q&A sessions, as we have a lot of people on the webinar today. If you have any additional questions, please add them in the Q&A or message me in the chat, and I'll help you to figure out any logistical issues. With that, I'm going to turn the time over to Ron, who will give us a brief introduction, a little bit of an overview of U.S.-Israeli economic and military relationships, after which we'll start the presentation. Ron, take it away.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. My name is Ron Zamir. I'm actually here wearing two hats. The first one that Jim mentioned, I am the chairperson of the Utah-Israel Economic Council. We are a group of local businesses, many of us having interest in commerce in Israel, that were formed, I would say now probably 4 or 5 years ago, in the context of the governor's missions to Israel. Since then, we've been a source to help Utah companies who want to explore the Israeli market. Every year we try to help some of our members and others go to Israel, now that we can't go, but usually when you can go, there are a lot of flights to Israel from Utah through Europe and through New York. I also am here as the CEO and one of the partners in Allen-Com, which is a technical and training services firm here in Utah, in Salt Lake. And we do business in Israel and are currently involved with some defense contractors there, and the FMF is kind of a format for some of those relationships. Just a few words on why this is so special, and I think special for Utah. Jim mentioned that we have a very strong defense industry here relative to the size of the Utah economy, of course. More importantly, the FMF, or foreign military funds, that we're talking about in relation to Israel are very unique, in the American ecosystem. Most U.S. defense spending is spent boots on the ground in Europe and in Asia. In the case of aid to Israel, which is almost purely, like Jim said, militarily, almost all of that money is spent back here in the U.S. So we're talking about an amazingly large opportunity for American companies. Often when we go to Israel, we see other states that have booths as well as official representatives in Israel. So there's definitely examples here in Utah of companies that are doing large contracts through FMF, through the commercial framework of FMF, as well as companies like ours that not only do the FMF, but also have direct relationships. In recent years, we're seeing more and more Israeli companies acquire or invest in Utah businesses. That's a very interesting trend. Utah is very attractive to Israeli businesses who want to be near California or are looking to take advantage of some of the high tech here in the state. So that is an opportunity for local companies to build relationships that may lead to inward investment. And I want to keep that in mind as well. So again, we are here. Well, I'll put our website in chat later on, but we're here to help and happy to answer any questions from our own experiences being on the system with the MOD, as well as relationships with the Israeli defense contractors. Back to you, Jim.
This time we'll turn it over to Victor to start the presentation. Thanks, Ron.
Okay, I'd like to start by thanking Ron and Jim and Hannah and everybody else who's involved in putting all of this together. This is not actually the first time we're doing this. 3 years ago, 3 people from our office, I was one of them, came to Utah, and we did a presentation in Utah with everybody all in the same room, and it went very, very well. And I think as a result of that, I guess Ron felt this is something that periodically we should be doing again. To any of you who may have been at that presentation 3 years ago, I thank you for joining us again. And to those of you who were not there, I hope you're going to find this helpful. Our office here, I'll just take a couple minutes to talk about that before I get into the FMF itself. But the Defense Ministry has a number of missions, offices outside of Israel. The largest is the office here in New York. We have about 150 people here. That's made up of about 30 career Defense Ministry civil servants who come here for a term of about 4 years and then go back. So for example, the head of Boris's department, Einat Igorn, head of the Economic Analysis Department, is one of those what we call shlichim, emissaries. Then the bulk of our workforce is made up of young Israelis, such as Boris, who are in their 20s, in their 30s, may or may not already have a bachelor's degree or an advanced degree. Boris has both. But many of them are actually people who are coming, and part of what they're doing in the United States is studying. They finished their military service, and it gives them the opportunity to work here in the United States while they're going to school, which normally you cannot do if you were here on a traditional student visa. So we have about 110 people who fall into that category, and they work as buyers or cost analysts or treasury analysts or all sorts of other positions. And then we have a very small number of American employees, 9 of them. 3 are the lawyers here, myself and 2 others, our secretary, a travel person. We have a person who does economic analysis with a finance background who's an American. We have a CPA who works in our Treasury Department. And again, a small number of people in that category. The main function of our office is procurement, and it's procurement using the $3.3 billion of foreign military financing funds that Israel receives from the U.S., very generously provided by the U.S. to Israel. As you heard, the current amount is as per a 10-year MOU that was negotiated in 2016 and took effect for fiscal year 2019, will run through U.S. fiscal year 2028. We also do, and I'm somewhat involved in, some government-to-government research and development cooperative programs. There's an MOU between the 2 countries, separate and apart from that FMF MOU, but reciprocal defense procurement and joint R&D programs, things like that. So I get involved in that. And then just other issues and other things that come up between the 2 countries, where this office is sort of the representative office for the Defense Ministry. In terms of our procurement activities, you're going to hear more about this from Boris. We buy a very wide range of items, what you would consider to be sort of pure military items, but then also a lot of IT, computer hardware, software, medical equipment, communications equipment, many, many different types of things. Basically, just about anything that an army and armed forces, such as the IDF, might need. Our purpose today is to give you a taste, because obviously we don't have a lot of time, but to educate and inform you about what it is we do here, what the rules are that govern what we do, and then Boris will get into the nuts and bolts of, how you can get onto our vendor list, our qualified vendor list, and become one of our suppliers. We are always looking to expand our list of suppliers. We probably have, and Boris will give you the numbers, but we may have a couple thousand vendors who are on our list. In any given year, there are, hundreds who are receiving purchase orders. But that is the list we look to when we're sending out requests for proposals in terms of companies that we have sort of vetted and on an initial basis have information about them, and they are eligible in our eyes to, in our minds, to receive the RFPs and then submit proposals and enter into contracts with us. Now jumping into the FMF, and I think you have the first slide there. And I apologize for the pace for which we're going to go through them, but if you have questions, you can ask, or you can always contact me afterwards. I think you have Boris provided a list that has all of our contact information. But the money that we're using here, the foreign military financing, the acronym FMF, that is the bulk of what's received under the 10-year MOU. There's also $500 million worth of missile defense funds that Israel receives on an annual basis. We in our office are somewhat less involved with that. We do have some involvement on some of those procurements, but for the most part, that is managed out of Israel. What we're managing is the $3.3 billion of FMF. And there are 2 ways that we can use it. We can use it in foreign military sales, which are government-to-government contracts, where we in essence sign a contract with the Department of Defense, and then the Department of Defense supplies us the items either out of its own stocks, or more often than not, it goes out and contracts with a vendor for those items. But there you would have a U.S. government contracting officer, issuing the contract to the vendor supplying the item. So for example, the F-35s that we're buying, that's an FMS case. We have a letter of offer and acceptance. That's the contract with the Department of Defense. They have the contract with Lockheed Martin for the aircraft. The second form of contracting that we use, what is called DCCs, direct commercial contracts, literally means exactly what it sounds like. We are in direct commercial contact with the vendors. We send out the RFPs, we get the proposals, we conduct the negotiations, we issue the purchase order, we take delivery, we receive the invoices, we ship all the items to Israel. We actually do the shipping for the FMS items as well. Those items flow into a warehouse that we have an arrangement with in New Jersey that receives all of the items that come in, both FMS and DCC, handles our export licensing, then the items go to Israel. The FMF assistance, whether it's FMS or DCC, is administered by an agency in the Department of Defense called the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the DSCA. They issue the funding approvals for our DCCs. They issue the LOAs for our FMS cases. And we deal with them on a day-to-day basis in both of those channels. The money that we're using, the FMF, though, does not come from the Department of Defense budget. It actually comes from the Department of State's budget, from the Foreign Operations budget. And so the Department of State also has a very important say in how we're using that FMF. And it's kind of inserted itself, but it's become sort of much more involved, I would say, during the last 10 years in terms of overseeing that program. The people of the Department of State speak occasionally with us. They speak on a very frequent basis with the DSCA. They have their own sort of thoughts on, what are the appropriate items for spending FMF. And over the years, they've issued guidance, not just for Israel, but for other countries as well. The State Department has about what they consider to be appropriate or inappropriate in terms of the use of FMF. In terms of that MOU that you heard about, the 10-year MOU, which provides for the $3.3 billion of FMF and the $500 million of missile defense funds each year, we began that MOU in October of 2018. In others, that's when the U.S. fiscal year 19 started, runs through fiscal year 2028. And part of it, and this is what Ron was alluding to earlier, there is a certain portion of the FMF money that we're allowed to spend in Israel, but the bulk of the funds have to be spent in the United States. And in fact, over the next 8 years, we're now 2 years into the MOU, more and more of that money has to be spent in the US. We were allowed to spend for many, many years approximately 26% of the FMF money in Israel, contracts directly between the Ministry of Defense and Israeli defense contractors for Israeli-made systems. That is being phased out. So each year, and there's a gradual phase out, but each year, less and less of that $800 million can be spent in Israel. More has to be spent in the United States, together with what was already, the other, 74% of the funds, which always had to be spent in the United States. So when we get to the end of this MOU, all $3.3 billion will have to be spent in the United States. Like I said, right now, we're in a sort of a situation where we have to spend approximately, a little more than $2.5 billion in the US and something under $800 million we're allowed to spend in Israel. But that's just to kind of further emphasize what Ron said about the growing opportunity. It was already a lot of money we're spending here, and that amount that we're spending here is going up. Israel receives its funds through annual legislation. There is this 10-year MOU, but it's the Congress in the course of the appropriations process that actually appropriates the money. Israel's allowed to use the money on what's called a cash flow financing basis, which means that what the DSCA is looking at is that our payments in any given year do not exceed the $3.3 billion we have available during that year. We can sign contracts for amounts larger than that, and that's very important because when you sign a contract for, let's say, 20 F-35s, that contract, may be on the order of $2.5 to $3 billion. So if you were limited to signing contracts for the value of that year's FMF, you wouldn't have been able to sign any other contracts in that year. We're on a cash flow financing basis, like I said, so we may have $7 or $8 billion of contractual commitments, both in the FMS and DCC channels out there, and the DSA is monitoring the cash flow. All of the other countries who get FMF are limited. They are on a commitment financing basis. They can only sign contracts whose total value does not exceed the FMF they have available in that particular year. So it very much limits what they can do. In March of 2017, it was the last time the DSCA updated its FMF guidelines. There are links to the guidelines on the DSCA's website. And I think somewhere in these slides, I have a reference to the DSCA's website. But you can find the FMF guidelines, you can find their contractor certification forms, and those are the forms that provide the rules for the use of the FMF. I mentioned how over the last 10 years, the State Department has become more involved in the sense of, from a policy perspective, what we can or can't buy. So just for example, if there was a time we could buy food for the IDF, or exercise equipment, or office equipment, or furniture, all of that has been phased out, really going back close to 10 years. And they've tightened up their policy in some other areas, what we can do with the Corps of Engineers in terms of construction, what we can do when it comes to IT hardware and software, research studies, things like that. And those last categories I just mentioned, those are all things we can still do, but like I say, with a little fine tuning on what is eligible and what is not. I'm now actually, I apologize, Hannah, I've moved a couple of slides. So if we can now go to the slide that has the heading procurement channels. And I'll start with the commercial channel, which I think is of the most interest to you, because that is what we are doing out of our office here, dealing directly with the vendors. You know, the DSCA allows us to use the commercial channel. They like to be briefed in advance, not like to be, they expect to be briefed in advance on what we're buying in the commercial channel, because in some instances, they may decide that in fact the FMS channel is the more appropriate channel for that particular item or system. The guidelines, when you read them, provide some guidance on that. And like I said, we have a continuing dialogue with the DSCA, especially on our larger system procurements, to just touch base with them as to whether we can use the DCC's direct commercial contracts or whether we have to go FMS. Companies have to sign the DSA's contractor certification. It is a 6 or 7 page form with many, many sections in there that, you know, it's very important you read that carefully. It's applicable to any procurement of $100,000 or more. And it's something that, you know, the DSCA takes seriously, and vendors really need to take seriously as well in terms of what you're signing up to. The sort of heart and soul of FMF procurement is the fact that we have to be buying from US companies, and we have to be buying US origin items. So a lot of the guidelines, a lot of what the guidelines deal with are the rules governing US content, and I'm going to get into that very, very briefly. The DSCA has oversight measures. There are audits that they do for sole source procurements. There's an audit that they do if it's a $2.5 million or more procurement in advance of approving the procurement, to see if the price is fair and reasonable. They use the DCAA and the DCMA for those audits. For any procurement of $1 million or above, regardless of whether it's sole source or competed, they do what they call a contract administration audit, an after the fact audit, while the contract's being performed, or maybe after performance is completed, to make sure that the contractor was in fact in compliance with the contractor certification. As part of the process, we have to get a funding approval for each and every purchase order or contract. And depending on the amount of the procurement, there may or may not be a need for a congressional notification. And you see there in the slides what the standards used to be and what they are now. In 2010, Israel was put in the category of NATO, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, for preferential treatment, which means a higher threshold for triggering the requirement, $25 million of major defense equipment or $100 million of regular defense articles, and a shorter notification period, 15 days rather than 30 days. And then, of course, there's always the need to get an export license, depending on the nature of the item. It may be a State Department license, maybe a Commerce Department license. And if it's a Commerce Department controlled item, there may in fact be no license required, which is true for many, many commerce controlled items. The next slide. Again, a little bit less relevant for what we're talking about right now, but this is just an overview of the FMS process where we have the contract, the letter of offer and acceptance with the DoD. They have the contract with the vendor. The process can take quite a while, and it runs on a consecutive basis, not concurrently. So there could take a number of months until we get the LOA back from the DoD and that's signed up. We sign it very quickly, but the preparation of the LOA can take time. And only then the DoD goes out and negotiates and finalizes a contract with the vendor. So one of the advantages of the DCC channel is it can move much faster. There are also US content rules. They're a slight bit more liberal in the FMS channel. You still have to have a US company and what is a US origin item, but there is a little more flexibility in financing the non-US content within a US origin item if it's the FMS channel. That's one of the sort of the carrots or the incentives for us using FMS. There's also a congressional notification process with similar dollar thresholds. And in the FMS process, there are fees and loadings that apply that can add, as you see, between 5 and 10% to the overall price. That's, in one sense, that's a disadvantage of the FMS channel. It costs more because of that, but that is also, and we recognize that that's what's funding the infrastructure of the security assistance staffing for the DSCA. And so in order for them to be there in a crisis where, you know, all of a sudden we need to get things very, very quickly through the DoD, either from DoD stocks or from them to go out and get things very, very quickly on our behalf, we recognize the fact that, you know, if they don't have the personnel, if they don't have the infrastructure, they're not going to be able to do that for us. And therefore that money, those loadings are well spent in the sense of, you know, supporting that infrastructure. Now moving to selection of procurement channel. The basic rules are that if an item has a national stock number, an NSN, meaning the US DoD procures it for the US Armed Forces, or if it's what's called a modified NSN item, it has an NSN and there's just some changes being made for us, but it's still basically an NSN item, we have to use the FMS channel. There are some exceptions. If we can prove that we can get a much cheaper price in the commercial channel, or if we have an urgent need for the item and we can get a much faster delivery date, we have to present the backup for that, and then the DSA makes a decision. Computer-related items, freshness-sensitive items, those are the safety items, and production line raw materials. Those are items that the DSA will allow us to buy commercially, even if they have an NSN. Non-NSN items, we can generally use the commercial channel, though there are times where the DSA wants to see us buy some of those items through the FMS channel. We had some truck procurements that fell into that category where the DSA said they should be purchased to FMS. Unique systems, for example, when we bought the SAR-5 Corvettes, when we bought the Matbat infantry training program, we have other, unique programs going on now. Those sorts of things, we're generally allowed to use the commercial channel. It used to be automatic that we were. Now the DSA asks a number of questions, wants to understand why they can't be purchased through the FMS channel. But if we can make the case that it's something that really we need to be in direct technical contact with the vendor, and there isn't a lot of added value associated with the DoD buying it on our behalf, then they will let us buy those items through the commercial channel. And there's a minimum threshold. Purchase orders below $40,000 generally have to be purchased through the FMS channel. And there are a couple of exceptions there that you see in that category. And part of that was the DSCA wanted to reduce the volume of the direct commercial channel purchase orders to make it easier for them to effectively oversee those purchase orders that do get issued as DCCs. And so one way of doing that was to have these low dollar value purchase orders go to the FMS channel. In terms of who we can work with, it's got to be a US corporation. Company cannot have been suspended or debarred. You may want to move ahead a little bit with the slides there. I'm on the slide that's, the heading is vendor eligibility. And the qualifications or experience, the DSA may decide to do a pre-award survey. They usually don't. That's often a function of they get a complaint from vendor A saying, how is vendor B even participating in this competition? They don't have experience. They don't know what they're doing when it comes to these sorts of items. That may trigger the DSCA doing a pre-award survey. In the few instances when they've done them, they've come back and affirmed, our decisions in terms of, who we're allowing to participate, who we're awarding the contract to, because we're careful about that as well. In terms of vendors, both the DSCA and we ourselves prefer dealing with manufacturers rather than dealers or distributors. There are times where, you know, there's no choice. There are certain companies that will not deal directly with the purchasers, not just us, but others as well, and will only work through distributors, in which case it should be an authorized distributor with a long-standing relationship selling that company's item. A vendor has to add value. It can't just be some desk and telephone operation that gets a purchase order, you know, takes its, you know, X percentage points and passes it along to someone else who's doing all the work. We don't want that, and the DSCA doesn't want that. The DSCA and we, again, have a preference for competitions rather than sole source procurements. And I think I mentioned earlier, if it is sole source of $2.5 million or more, there's a requirement for that pricing survey. Next slide. In terms of the US content, non-US content, and to really go through this thoroughly would take about an hour, but in 1 minute, what I would say is, you know, there are certain red lines. In order to qualify as a U.S. origin item, we have to be buying from a U.S. company. There has to be manufacturing that's taking place in the U.S. The item's got to be at least 51% U.S. content. That includes profit and loadings, G&A, things like that. Those things are considered U.S. content. And there has to be final assembly in the United States. The DSCA in this last round of guidelines revisions that were done in 2017 introduced a new sort of calculation methodology at the first tier subcontractor level. They required not just the prime to fill out a contractor certification form, but there's a flow down, and now there's a formal first tier subcontractor certification. There are, you know, differences in how the first tier subcontractors do their calculations vis-a-vis the prime. That's explained in the guidelines. There's also sort of an all or nothing kind of a test. If you're a first tier subcontractor and you're able to certify that you're at least 51% US content and that you have manufacturing in the US, your content turns into 100% US content. If you're less than 51, it turns into 0% US content. Israeli content is never eligible for FMF, certainly in the DCC. I'll address it in the FMS context in a moment. They also have begun applying a substantial, or allowing vendors to apply a substantial transformation test for COTS, commercially available off the shelf, IT hardware. That was a result of a lot of input from some of the IT hardware manufacturers. It's something that, you know, people are familiar with in other aspects of U.S. government procurement, and in terms of the customs rules on what's considered a U.S. origin item. It traditionally was not a part of FMF procurement. Now it is for COTS IT hardware. After we go through that whole analysis and we determine what the US content is, the bottom line is we can then fund the US content with FMF. And then the question becomes, what about the non-US content? We have an item 60% US, 40% non-US. We can fund the 60% with FMF. In certain limited situations in the DCC channel, we can fund the 40% as well. And those situations are if the US government, test used to be the DoD, but now it's the US government, other agencies as well. If they buy that same end item with that same non-US content, that same US end item with the same non-US content, then we can fund the non-US content with FMF as well. In other words, pay 100% FMF. They want to see DSA wants to see a contract number, the name of a contract officer to verify for themselves that in fact the US has bought that item. Second exception is if it's a commercially available off-the-shelf item, then that 60% item with the 40% non-US content is eligible for 100% FMF funding. There's a definition in the guidelines of what's considered a COTS item. It's something that's sold in substantial quantities in the commercial marketplace in the United States. So it's not just enough that you sell it to the DoD or to other armed forces. It's got to be, you know, something sold in the commercial marketplace. So when we buy laptops or servers or Ford pickup trucks, things like that, they qualify as COTS items. So that 45% of Far Eastern content or, you know, Mexican content in the Ford truck, we can pay for it 100% with FMF because it meets the COTS definition. And if there's any other non-US content that doesn't fall into A or B, then we would have to use our own national funds for that. We also get our FMF money in the beginning of the year when the congressional appropriations pass on time, which is not the case lately. it sits in a Federal Reserve bank account, earns interest. Interest rates are very low, but we have some more flexible rules in terms of how we use the interest funds. And one of those things we can do is the non-U.S. content within the U.S. origin item, where the non-U.S. content is otherwise ineligible for FMF, again, but not if it's Israeli content. Next slide. We're almost at the end, so I apologize if I'm going slightly over. If we don't comply with what you saw on the prior page, then the DSCA says to us, why don't you buy it through the FMS channel? Because again, so long as we met the red line tests, then we're allowed to fund the non-U.S. content within that U.S. origin item, not just if it's COTS or if the U.S. government bought the item, but so long as it's not Israeli content, we can fund that 40%. And so, like I said, in certain instances, the FMS channel becomes more attractive for that reason. Israeli content, the general rule is we either have to use our national funds for it, or we'd have to use some of that $800 million a year, that amount that's now declining every year, the OSP funds. We'd have to use that to pay for the Israeli content. We can't use regular FMF. The only exception is if the DoD, now not just the US government in general, but if the DoD is buying the same US end item with the same Israeli content, let's say there's 20% Israeli content in an item that we're buying from a US defense contractor, and the DoD is buying it for its own use, not because they're buying it on behalf of some foreign country for an FMS case, but because the US Armed Forces are going to be using it. So an example is the helmets that are used by the pilots for the JSF. Elbit has a major role in the manufacturing of those helmets, or the wings on the JSF. Some of them are manufactured by Israel Aircraft Industries. Or going back, many, many years, there was, the Popeye missile, the AGM-142, there was a joint venture between Lockheed Martin and Rafael, and the U.S. Air Force was buying some for itself. So in that instance, we're allowed to buy the U.S. end item through an FMS case, and the DoD will allow us to fund that 20, 30, 40% Israeli content with regular FMF. It does not apply to the commercial channel. So if you're bidding on a procurement for us and you have Israeli content, you'd have to spell that out in terms of how much it is, what its value is, and we would have to pay for it with national funds. We couldn't use FMF. Now I'm on the last slide. The guidelines provide for payment terms. They limit the amount of any advance payments. The overwhelming bulk of our procurements are done on a sort of net 30 payment upon delivery basis. But we sometimes have larger procurements, multi-year procurements, complicated systems where there is a need to make progress payments. So the guidelines provide a limit of 15% on the advance payment. The total of all progress payments, including the advance payments, can't exceed 85%. And we have to get some sort of security, financial guarantee for any money paid in advance of deliveries. So the guidelines have criteria for which US banks are eligible to issue letters of credit as that financial guarantee. And then the last thing I have here on this set of slides is agents' commissions. You do not need to work with an agent in order to sell to us. Some companies may find it helpful to have a representative in Israel who's familiar with the Israeli market and the perceived needs of the IDF. That's their decision, but it is by no means required. The bulk of the companies that work with us do not have agents in Israel. The DSCA prohibits, if there is an agent and that agent's receiving some sort of a commission, that commission cannot be funded with FMF. There is a place on the contractor certification where the vendor has to certify whether or not there is an agent. If so, how much is the commission? Has to certify that it's not being paid, not built into the price. If a vendor's paying for it with its own separate funds, it's going to have to be able to prove that on an audit, that none of the FMF was used to pay a commission, something the DSCA takes seriously and we take seriously as well. And it is something that, like I say, that does get audited. There are some companies that have retainer agreements. Let's say a big company, a Lockheed Martin, may have a retainer agreement. They pay some agent in Israel, X dollars a month to meet them at the airport and make arrangements for them and, set up meetings and things like that, not tied to any particular contract or purchase order. That the DSCA is okay with, so long as, again, it's not coming out of the FMF money we're paying on the individualized procurements. This is just sort of a taste in terms of an overview. There's a version of these slides that's 3 times as long and a lecture that's much longer, but this is all we had time for right now. I hope it's of help. And like I said, if you have any questions, you can always come back to me later. And I guess now we can turn it over to Boris for his part.
Hi, everybody. So can we switch to the presentation also? Good. And if you can go to the slide just after the map, it would be good. That's it. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining, and thanks the Utah officials for organizing this event. I personally participated in many events in many states of this kind, and we always find it very important to create these collaborations and to reach out to the vendors and try to expand both our procurement channels and give more opportunities to local companies to expand their business and develop the relationships. So I want just to refer quickly to the OSP portion that Victor mentioned. We're talking about ending it around 2024. The portion of the money that we could convert to national funds and purchase back in Israel. This goes back to the US. It seems as if we're enlarging procurement here, and it is right. It is a lot of money, a lot of opportunities, but you need also to take into account that many states are competing and many companies are competing for this portion of the money. And we also will see probably Israeli companies, the big and large defense contractors, tapping into these new funds and moving many lines into the US. On that note, I think it should be also an opportunity for you, not only to explore the direct procurement, but also to create relationships with these companies and explore the opportunities there. Basically, to see if you can even in some cases be a subcontractor and benefit from a relationship with these companies to tap into these fundings. Basically, as Victor said, also, we're procuring anything that moves related both to the military sector and sometimes to the private sector also. So we're buying for Air Force, Navy, Army, C4I, logistics, and special units. The funding is a bit different, but basically we're buying anything from SOCs to ships, aircrafts, and a lot of logistic equipment for soldiers. Since there is a lot of aerospace industries, there are a lot of aerospace industries in this Zoom meeting, so I just wanted to refer to the aerospace. We do have the big contracts with the big companies, some of them present here as well, but we do see in recent years more and more need for new vendors to come in and give us solutions for obsolete items and support items for the aircrafts, which are harder and harder to find these years. Can you please skip to the next one? Thank you. So on the procurement chain, also to understand where we are standing in this process, it basically abstractly works that the IDF unit, either it's the Air Force, Navy, or etc., they present us with a need. The need is developed in the IDF. The MOD mission here, as was said previously, almost 150 people, has a lot of resources here to support these needs and to reach out to the companies. This creates some relationship with the companies that is a bit on a deeper level and more, the expertise is higher because every sector of the procurement has more buyers to deal with the different projects, and we see that it's very beneficial for both sides. After the need arrives here and we analyze it and we approve the documents, a competition is being held or a sole source procurement is being provided, and then the PO is issued according to the regulations and the guidelines of the DSCA. And next one, please. The main types of tenders or competitions that are being used in the MOD are economic, which is basically the lowest price wins. This is probably the most common one that we're using. Some competitions are also economic and technical, meaning the score is combined from the lowest price score plus various technical um, specifications that we're requiring in that competition, which also get scored. And in recent years, we have a directive from the MOD in Israel to increase our dynamic, also known as reversed auctions, here in the US. So you might see them from time to time as well. It's basically we're giving you setting a price from which we're trying to get the vendors to deduct their price and give us discount. And basically similar to something you would see on eBay or other auction places. Please, one more. In order to see general documentation and the next stages that I'm going to explain about in order to register and start working with a mission and explore the opportunities, you need to go to this website. Next one, please. On this website, as I said, you'll find all the information you need and all the forms you need. You will go, on this website, you have the e-commerce. The e-commerce is basically the platform, just like the DoD uses, in which we upload all our procurement, and you can go in and explore the various projects or RFPs, RFIs, etc., that are currently being listed and our needs as were built by the buyers. The first station that you'll visit here is probably the vendor registration. Please skip to the next one. There is a short explanation on the website, but if you see something that is unclear, you can always refer back to me or to our vendor manager. That you will have all the list, all the information in the end of this presentation. Please, next one. The registration requires a certain information. There is a questionnaire. It's quite detailed, but some of the information is not mandatory or not required at first. You can always give it later. Our main the main things that we do require is for a company to be at least 2 years in business. We require a certain threshold of business done by the company previously, and that's in order to avoid dealing with some pop-up companies that looking for opportunity, but we're not sure that they can provide it. Also, to prevent events where a company whose profits are, let's say, $1 million, we don't want them to compete for $20 million contracts. So we're trying to be fair to everybody. If there is anything, again, not clear with a questionnaire, there is some data that you cannot provide at a certain stage, or you want to have more information, please refer back to us and we'll help you with the registration. Please skip to the next one. After you register and fill out the questionnaire, we'll do some small due diligence and a background check on the company. And after that, if everything is okay and all the forms were submitted correctly, you will receive an SMS with your password and log in to the website, and you'll be able to enter and view. If you can skip to the next one. This is basically how it looks once you will be inside. So when a buyer builds the RFP or RFQ, he has in mind certain companies that he's used to work with in the certain industry. And he will fill out these companies inside the RFQ. In such case, if your company is already registered and the buyer is familiar with you, you'll get a dedicated like prompt message in your email saying, hey, there vendor this and this, you have a new procurement opportunity waiting for you in the dashboard. Please go and view it. In other cases, when the buyer is not familiar with you, either because you're new or maybe the buyer is new, you can always enter this dashboard and explore the opportunities by yourself. If there is anything that you think that you may qualify for, or you want to explore further the opportunity, you have the information of the buyer under the buyer group and the telephone number, and you always can reach out to the buyer and ask him to give you permission to view further information of this certain RFP. So we'll see that also a lot, and you basically, again, when you register, we have an explanation, but you can also ask us and we'll explain better how to explore the dedicated and certain opportunities for your industry. And next one, please. This is the list of the directors. So as you saw on the platform, you have the buyers information and telephones. I think that's the best source to go to. But initially, if you want to explore whether your company's products are even something that might interest the MOD, or you want to send some brochures, information to pitch your product, I think you should definitely start with the directors and us to explore whether the opportunity exists or not. Because for some companies, unfortunately, the products are not related to something we procure here. So you can always reach out to them and they will refer you to either the manager or the buyer, or will provide you the required information by themselves. And that's about it.
All right, thank you, Boris and Victor. Appreciate the presentation. I do have a number of questions for you. We're going to take a minute to ask those. For anyone on the webinar today, please use the Q&A function if you're interested in asking a question. If not, you can always follow up with Boris or with me afterwards, and we'd be happy to help you answer those. So let me start with a question that Kurt Olson asked. I think this was related to some of the restrictions on eligible projects that Victor mentioned. He says, given the tighter limitations on what money can be spent on, are services, such as electronics engineering design services, an allowable expense item?
No. In other words, if we have a need for those sort of design services, we would be able to procure them. What I can tell you is we don't do a lot of procurement of this sort of standalone design services. In other words, there isn't the issue of it's like a treadmill or a food item or exercise, that kind of stuff, physical fitness stuff. There's no policy issue. I would say the issue is not, so it's not going to be with the DSCA or with the State Department. It's generally, we are not sort of coming to the U.S. market with a question of, how to design something. And when there is a design element, it's usually as part of a production contract. In other words, we're buying a piece of equipment and maybe there's some tweaking that has to be done to the company's existing equipment. So that there may be a little bit of a development phase that precedes the production phase in our contract with the manufacturer. But generally speaking, and Boris, you could correct me if I'm wrong, if you've seen these, we usually are not coming to the U.S. market saying, can you help us design something?
Right, correctly. We do have basically a couple of some experience in that. Actually, mostly for the intelligence C4I units and special units. Some of them worked very well. Some of them less, unfortunately, because when we're coming here to design something and develop some technology or electronics or something, there is an element of time, and sometimes that doesn't work so well to do it overseas. But we do have some experience. It varies, and we'll need to know more about what kind of design we're speaking here. But we do have some examples of that.
Thank you both. A next question from Gary Olson. If a comparable product is being manufactured and sold in Israel, do those products usually not find much traction for FMS sales? If there is a strong preference to buy Israeli products and save FMF money for items not manufactured by Israeli companies?
So I guess it's something we can probably both answer. From my perspective, unfortunately, because of the shortage of shekels, national funds, there are many instances in which there is a product available on the Israeli market that would meet the IDF's needs, but they simply don't have the national funds available to buy it. What they have available are FMF funds, and so we come to the U.S. market to buy those items, which, like I said, could have been procured in Israel. Maybe they could have even been procured, somewhat less expensively in Israel. There are calculations that get done by, in the group where Boris used to work for the Ministry of Defense before he came here, the budget division, because there comes a point where if the difference is so great, if it's just so much more expensive to come and buy it in the U.S., then someone will make the decision, this doesn't make sense. We just need to change priorities, find the national funds, buy it in Israel. But the fact that something's available in Israel does not preclude the possibility of us buying it in the U.S. There are many instances where that, in fact, does happen, where we do buy that sort of an item in the U.S.
Right, and I just want to add that it also sometimes depends on the scope of procurement. We're able, generally the companies here are a bit bigger and we can buy more, or the delivery dates are shorter. Sometimes the industries are in Israel are also smaller, and it's harder to get the same product at the same time, even if it's cheaper or something.
Thank you both. Dr. Bob Angel asks, we are a shop that has strict ITAR rules and restrictions due to our specialty. What is required to work with your group and provide services for heavily ITAR restricted companies? Thank you.
The main thing from our perspective is, number one, we're very happy if a vendor is, who is selling items, State Department controlled items, is very cognizant of and on top of, the ITAR requirements. So, for example, there may be a situation where we're sending a group from the IDF to come and visit and sort of see what the capabilities are that a company has. Well, even to just show us around, or to have us sit in a conference room and present to us, there may be a need for a technical assistance agreement in order for the company to provide that information. So we are gratified if a company says to us, listen, we want to have you come, but we will need to get this TAA approved by the State Department first, or to give you the detailed technical proposal that you want. So we work with those situations, and we would much rather work with somebody who, like I say, is on top of it, knows what they need to do, rather than someone who isn't. And then in the end, it's a problem for both the company and a problem for us if it turns out that our people came and saw things and there was a sort of, like I said, even they didn't walk out with equipment, but there's a sort of a deemed export in the process of, explaining things or presenting things to us. So we are able to work with that. We buy many sensitive items. We buy many, many State Department controlled items. And like I said, the main thing is just to let us know up front, not for us to find out a day before people are coming that there's going to be a need to get certain authorizations. But, everything can be handled on a timely basis, and it is not an impediment to working with us.
Thank you, Victor. I have another question, though the name is a bit obscure. This question is specifically for Boris, and I think it's one you actually answered during the presentation. Is there a website to visit to get a list of active RFPs and RFIs? Related, is there a group within IDF to suggest an RFP be written?
The last part, please, again.
Is there a group within IDF to suggest an RFP be written? I think that the question is there a way to suggest certain projects or RFPs to an IDF?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, for the first part, The access to the platform that I showed, the list of RFPs is ongoing RFPs. It's not accessible publicly. You do have to register in order to view them, unlike some platforms of the DoD. That's because some of it is sensitive, of course. Then the second part was.
The second part is there a way to suggest to an IDF that there's an
Right.
to write it
So
out?
is there a way to suggest? Yes, there is a way. Sometimes if you have some sort of ongoing relationship, usually it's not the first procurement, but afterwards, you can speak with a IDF POC or something like that. Generally speaking, you do have to go through us. You're not allowed formally to go and just speak with the IDF as a direct channel. That's because we have to comply with the guidelines here, and the IDF does not deal with the guidelines. They just basically manage the needs and give us the funds. So you need to go through us, pitch the product or something, or all the information that you want to us, and we will find the correct POC in the IDF, and we'll reach out to them. And if further discussion needs to be held between the POC and the company, we can even have a conference call or something like that and proceed interesting the IDF with the item.
I just want to add to what Boris was saying. You know, within the Defense Ministry, there's a very sort of strict differentiation between what the IDF does and then what the civilian procurement directorate people do. And there is an attempt to sort of, you know, keep the IDF people away from the direct commercial contact with the vendors, because often, you know, not good things come out of that. So the IDF, they define their technical need, they allocate the budget, but it's really the civilian side within the Defense Ministry, and here in the US that's represented by the mission, that handles the relationships with the vendors. So as Boris said, if you have something that you think would be of interest to the ground forces and that you say to yourself, ground forces in Israel may not even realize they need this item yet, but after they hear about it, they may be interested and they may prepare a requisition for it. So you would want to contact the director of the ground forces department here in the mission, send the brochures, send the information, and that can get the ball rolling. But we really do try to avoid a situation where the vendors are communicating, you know, directly with the military people.
Thank you. Carl Belknap asks, can technical data packages be provided for products included in the solicitations?
So I'm assuming that he's talking about the technical data packages, you know, coming from Israel to the US. Every once in a while, we have situations, not every once in a while, we have a number of them, of these sort of build to print type situations. There's a product, there's a design in Israel, the budget is in FMF, maybe it could easily have been built in Israel, but they don't have the national funds. So we're looking for a US vendor to manufacture that item. So then, you know, probably in the RFP, there'll be, you know, a certain level of description of the item, so the company's in a position to bid on it. And certainly at some point in the process, yeah, we would be transferring that technical data package to the United States. There'd be limitations in terms of its use. And then the company would use that as the basis for what they're manufacturing for us. So yes.
Perfect, thank you. Just two more questions and then we'll turn the time over to Sam. Keith Edwards asks, within FMF's DCC procurement channel, is the selling company responsible for the processing of the export license, either via DOS or for ITAR-related items or the Department of Commerce for EAR-regulated items?
So it varies. When we're buying something that is a complex, very expensive, maybe releasability issues, sensitive item, we will generally look to the vendor to get the export license. So we're buying a radar system or torpedoes or something like that. We would look to the vendors. Usually it's the larger defense contractors, medium-sized defense contractors, to be responsible for the license. And with the advantages, and as a lawyer, what I prefer is that, that way it becomes clear that contract's not going to enter into effect until the vendor, among other things, has obtained the export license, until we've got the funding approval, all those things. But the vendor's responsible for getting the license. There are many items, most of what we buy, we take responsibility. The lower tech items, certainly a lot of the Commerce Department controlled items, where within the warehouse that we use, they have a core group of people who are export licensing experts, and they prepare the export license applications and submit them, and on our behalf. We provide the end user information to them, and they're able to get these things processed very, very quickly. So again, I would say on a small percentage of our procurements, they're generally State Department controlled items, and the more sensitive ones where there's a risk. Will we or will we not get the export license? We have the vendor be responsible, and that's spelled out in the purchase order and the contract. There's a section that spells out who's responsible for getting the license.
Excellent. Thank you, Victor. Last question that we have here in the open tab. This is from John. I'm not sure what John's last name is. We are a manufacturer that builds testing equipment for military equipment that needs to be leak checked, i.e. submersible equipment, missiles, components, or other kinds of equipment. Who do we need to speak with? We work with their manufacturing suppliers typically.
Boris can answer this as well, but what I would say, first of all, we do buy test equipment, various types of test equipment. And so if, for example, it's for submersible items, I would say they should be in touch with our Navy department. It's what we call Machan 3, Department Number 3. They do all the procurement on behalf of the Navy. They also have to do a lot of the logistics procurement, but they would be the ones to contact.
Perfect. Thank you. That ends our questions for now. Thank you both. We'll have a little bit of extra time for question and answer at the end of Sam's presentation. So if you have more questions that you'd like to ask, please use that Q&A function. In the meantime, I will turn the time over to Sam from the Advocacy Center to talk more about the resources that they can offer to U.S. companies. Sam, you're on mute. Let me unmute you. We may have lost Sam.
No.
Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Looks like we've lost Sam. In the meantime, I did have another question. Oh, no, I didn't. I just failed to click done there. Okay.
May I just say 2 words?
Yes,
So,
please. Go ahead.
I see a lot of the people asking for the presentation or the context list. So
I'm back. Can you hear me?
oh, okay.
We can, Sam. Boris, go ahead, and then we'll turn it over to Sam.
So regarding the presentation itself, so it's a shorter version or key points of what appears in the DSA guidelines. So it's better to refer there and go there and read the guidelines to see the detailed picture. And regarding the general things like the contact list and things like that, you can find it on the website that I gave, the MOD website.
Thank you, Boris. We will be sending out these slides and recording and make a recording of the presentation available if you'd like it. So you will have access to that list directly through that channel as well. Thank you, Boris.
By the way,
Sam,
if I can say one thing, I have to say I was very impressed with the questions that were asked. I mean, they show that people were really listening and honing in on the important elements of what was talked about.
I agree. They were good questions. If you have other questions, please type them in the Q&A. Let's turn the time over to Sam.
All right. Yeah. Sorry about that. Let's try this again. So good morning. Thank you all for the invitation to speak today. I represent the Advocacy Center, which is housed within the Department of Commerce. I started at the AC back in November of last year, starting off covering West and North Africa. And about in April of this year, I took over the Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon portfolio as well. And things have actually been pretty busy in Israel, not so much on the defense side so far, but on the commercial side, but hoping to pick up on the MOD side soon. So next slide, please. So what is the Advocacy Center? It's about 25 people, kind of like myself. I'm more on the junior end. Some people have been there for 10, 15 years. But essentially, we're the link for US companies and the United States government. So we connect and approve US companies who are trying to sell their goods or services to a foreign government or foreign state-owned enterprise. And personally, I think it's one of the best kept secrets in the US government. I'm always surprised at how few companies are even aware of what the Advocacy Center is and how valuable it can be if it's used and used correctly. Next slide. So the overarching goal of the AC is to help level the playing field for US companies trying to win those foreign government contracts. And we do this by coordinating the actions of 14 government agencies who all have a hand in international trade in some way. So like I said, and this involves commercial as well as defense and security sales. Next slide, please. Just quickly, we do have liaisons at the major multilateral development banks. They help gather intelligence and can advocate within those organizations. Next slide. So what is USG advocacy? It consists of government-to-government communications, acts as a counterweight to what other foreign governments are doing. And we always try to promote a fairness and transparency to make sure that US companies are being given a fair shot. One thing I will note is that in order to be approved or really even considered for advocacy, the host country must actually indicate that they are seeking to purchase this product or service. So sometimes companies come to us when they're just trying to break into a foreign market and without being given the actual indication that the country is interested. We call this prospecting, and typically we pass this off to our UZACs or our commercial service teams abroad. Next slide, please. So kind of piggybacking off of that, what are some of the things that the AC doesn't do? You can see them listed here, but if you have any of these issues, I'd be happy to connect you to the relevant people, either in DC, one of our desk officers, or our commercial service team abroad. Next slide. So here's the actual advocacy process. First off, let me actually, there's a step one before the listed step one. I always encourage companies to reach out to me directly before they submit their questionnaire. Because there may be some things that that would preclude them from actually being accepted for advocacy, that they may not pick up on in the first place. So anyways, back to this chart here. So assuming that I give them the heads up or the go ahead on that, I ask them to submit a questionnaire, which I'll describe in more detail in a little bit. This also consists of an anti-bribery agreement. Then we kind of do our intake process. I send the questionnaire over to our team at the embassy to get their review. At the same time, I'm conducting my own due diligence on the US company, the foreign government entity, and just basically confirming that it's an actual live opportunity. So once we're ready to make a decision, it comes down to essentially, is US government support for this project in the US government's national interest? And if so, we will approve you for advocacy, there are two types. There's exclusive and there's national. So exclusive is when there isn't any other US companies that we know of or can confirm that are also seeking the same opportunity. Most of the time with defense cases, we provide a national interest determination or national advocacy determination, just because a lot of times in defense, companies come in at the last minute, we learn of them late in the process, and we try to minimize having to go back and going to like a minister of defense and saying, well, I know we told you about this great American company before, but here's another one that we also are supporting. So we just try to minimize those kinds of situations where possible. And most of the time, defense companies are pretty good about applying for advocacy in the first place. So once approved, I will put together a phone call between the company, our embassy team, and myself to craft an appropriate advocacy strategy. So a lot of times this takes into consideration what the company wants to accomplish. They know who the key decision makers already are, so who they want to target. And then myself and the embassy team will kind of be realistic about what kind of support we can actually get. And a lot of times this comes down to like a letter from the ambassador or something like that. And I'll actually get into those details in a little bit more in a minute. And then finally, after that's all created, we execute the strategy. So letters, meetings, deploying talking points, all that. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of background on the actual questionnaire. It's 7 pages, pretty straightforward. There are categories of where we just ask you to describe the project, the total value of the deal, and what the percentage of US export content would be, who your partners are, who your competitors are, and the USG export license information, which is most relevant for defense cases. So like I said, it's pretty straightforward. I don't think it would take too long to fill out. Most of the time it doesn't. I just always ask companies to be as specific as possible on the first go around. Get as much detail on there as possible. It's okay if you have to submit an addendum to the actual 7 pages. Don't mind that at all. Just makes my life a little bit easier. And one other thing I will note is that a lot of times US companies come to us when they're not the bidder of record. And in these cases, we require that the actual bidder of record sign both the questionnaire and the anti-bribery agreement. Next slide, please. So this is just the anti-bribery agreement here. Pretty straightforward. Just basically saying that you won't engage in bribing public officials involved in this contract. And a lot of times, or not a lot of times, but sometimes when we're doing our vetting and due diligence, we come across companies that have gotten in trouble in the past for bribery or some sort of corruption. And a lot of times we have to decline that company for advocacy. Don't like doing it, but just a fact of life. Next slide, please. So what criteria do we use when reviewing the advocacy questionnaire? It always comes down to the one simple question of whether or not this is in the US national interest, and everything kind of goes from there. So most of the time we require 50% of US export content for the goods or services that are part of the deal. We can make exceptions to this based on other considerations like the ones listed here in the middle of the slide. But I will say that once you are approved, you are eligible to be advocated for without or by name without any preference. And that goes back to the exclusive versus national determination as well. Next slide, thank you. Before I get to this one, I just want to quickly talk about how defense cases are slightly different in the intake and approval process. So for defense, there is an added layer of approvals that we have to get. So assuming that you do have a valid export license already, we have to submit an ITAR agreement memo that's crafted by myself and signed off on by our embassy team, the Defense Security Cooperation team at the embassy. And then this gets submitted to what's called the Defense Advocacy Working Group. It's basically just the interagency coordinating group for advocacy cases. So lately it's been taking about 1 to up to 2 months to get approvals through this. So you just have to consider that, it's not gonna, you're not gonna get the 1 week approval that we strive for commercial cases when we're submitting to the Defense Advocacy Working Group. But once that's approved, then you're pretty much back on track and proceeding as normally. So back to this slide. So our advocacy strategies, like I said, like to set up a phone call between the company, embassy team, and myself to go through the strategy. And so this can take a number of different identities. We can put together official correspondence. So I've been writing a lot of letters during the pandemic when meetings haven't been happening and as normal, no one's traveling anymore. So I've been crafting a lot of letters that have been going from our ambassador, our commercial service team, as well as officials here in DC. So our undersecretary for the International Trade Administration, Deputy Secretary of Commerce, all the way up to the Secretary of Commerce. In normal times, we would be having, assistant secretaries or undersecretaries or, any sort of U.S. official going abroad to meet with their counterparts at all times. And when that's going on, they typically come to the Advocacy Center and say, hey, do you have any active cases? It'd be helpful for us to raise them. And in that case, I will check with the company to make sure that they sign off on it and approve of the move, and we'll get talking points over to that U.S. official, and then hopefully they'll be able to raise those points in an in-person meeting. Next slide. So this is just a picture of all the different agencies and organizations that the Advocacy Center coordinates actions. For most of the time, we deal with the Export-Import Bank, the DFC, and the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. But we do often coordinate with the DoD on every defense case. And then DOE is also one of our big partners as well. Next slide. So basically, in summary, I encourage you all to apply for advocacy in order to access the full support of the U.S. government at various levels. I think it's very helpful to U.S. companies. Then, there's just a lot out there that you may not be thinking of that can help you win foreign contracts. Next slide. Again, this is just the USG officials who help with the advocacy. I will say, in my time, I haven't had President Trump raise any points on my behalf, but Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Ross, they've been busy during their travels and good promoters of our advocacy cases. And final slide. Here's just our contact info. We've got a whole list of our staff and contact info broken down by country. So I cover something like 23 countries. But wherever you need help across the globe, you can find a person at the Advocacy Center who's willing and able to help you. And I think that is it for me.
Thank you very much, Sam. Everyone should take a look at the Advocacy Center as an option to help make your bids more competitive. At this time, I'm not seeing any additional questions either for Sam or for Victor or for Boris. So I think we'll close the webinar here. I want to again thank Victor, Boris, and Sam for being our presenters on the webinar today, and to Ron for making this all possible. Before we end this webinar, any closing thoughts from any of you that you'd like to share?
I'll just say one thing, and just to the people here, it's amazing how much Israelis and Israeli companies are accessible. It's a small country. Don't be worried about reaching out directly. It's a lot easier to cold call to Israelis than it is to Americans. So, you know, build relationships, get to know the people there. It's a very lucrative way to grow your business. Just want to make that pitch.
Thank you, Ron. Victor, Boris, any last words? Victor, you're on mute. Victor, you're muted.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So yeah, now what I just wanted to say, first of all, thanking everybody for participating, but I guess you're anticipating sort of a second stage of maybe one or more roundtables focusing on particular industries, particular needs, you know, things like that, and we'll be happy to participate in that as well.
Correct. Thank you, Victor. Boris,
Right,
it was
so-
also, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you also. And I just want to make the last comment of develop the relationship with us also, not just the Israeli companies, and maintain it. And what I mean is, as Victor said, people who come here, the Israeli representatives, will come here for a limited time. Thus, you always have to maintain the relationship. And new people will come, you need to contact them and make sure that you're out there and your products are out there, and that we know that you exist and we do good business. So never forget that. And we'll be happy to have personal meetings anytime. Contact us. We're available for you. We're happy to speak with you.
Thank you both. As a few cleanup items before we close the meeting down. First, as Victor mentioned, we'll be having follow-up roundtables where you'll have an opportunity to meet with section leads or others who can talk more directly to procurement opportunities in your sector. Look for those to be scheduled in the coming weeks. There's also opportunities to meet one-on-one with some of these folks, as has been generously offered by Boris and Victor. We're glad to be able to take them up. If you're interested in hearing more about these topics generally, there's also an upcoming defense and security related meeting for as part of our virtual trade mission to Israel, which is going to be the bulk of which is happening next week. I'd advise you all to go to WTCUtah.com to look at that agenda and see if that's a meeting you'd be interested in participating in. You'll receive a follow-up email from me after this webinar is done with the slides and an option to rewatch the recording. So if you have any additional questions, please reach out to me and we'll be happy to help you out. Thank you for being on today. We hope that this translates into lucrative opportunities for you and for your business, and look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you all, and take care.